Great. Greetings again. Mr. Harris seems to like it here because he's coming back every few days, so it's a good sign. Elliot Harris, who you know is the UN's chief economist, is joined by Marta Roig, the chief of emerging trends and issues in DESA's development section, and they are here to brief you on DESA's World Social Report, Inequality in a Rapidly Changing World. Elliot, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs is proud to launch the World Social Report 2020, entitled Inequality in a Rapidly Changing World. At a time when the consequences of our deeply unequal world play out in daily headlines, this report shows that the inequality challenge is a global one, and it's intimately connected to other pressing issues of our time, including technological change, climate change, the climate crisis, international migration, and urbanization. The report underscores that these megatrends can be harnessed for a more equitable and sustainable world, or they can be left alone to divide us further. Despite its immense promise, technological change creates winners and losers, and its rapid pace brings additional new challenges. The report finds little evidence to suggest that recent technological changes will make work itself obsolete, but they are pushing wage inequality upward. To be sure, these new technologies can open tremendous opportunities in sectors such as health and education, but their potential to reduce inequalities is being thwarted by the persistent digital divides and policies that gear their benefits towards those at the top. Climate change has slowed down the reduction of inequalities between countries, and it presents a major obstacle to eradicating poverty. Within countries, people living in poverty, as well as other disadvantaged groups, including indigenous people and small-scale landholders, are disproportionately exposed to the risks of climate change. And it is affecting intergenerational inequality as well, by reducing the livelihood opportunities of young and future generations. Climate action and the transition to green economies bring opportunities for the reduction of poverty and inequality. And yet, as with any process of structural transformation and technological change, this too will result in job losses in some sectors of the economy. International migration is at an all-time high. Disparities between and within countries will inevitably drive people to continue to migrate. How much countries and migrants themselves benefit from migration depends on the conditions under which this migration takes place. Well-managed migration that allows migrants to use their skills productively in their host countries and to send remittances back at a reasonable cost is much more likely to generate positive effects that benefit immigrants, that benefit their source countries, and that benefit the host countries as well. With increases in migration from rural areas, more than half of the world's population now live in urban areas. Cities drive innovation and they boost prosperity, but many cities are also extremely unequal. Indeed, in an increasingly urban world, the future of overall inequality largely depends on what happens in the cities. Given the rapid pace of urbanization in the developing world, this report calls for addressing urban inequalities now in order to leverage the potential benefits of this powerful global megatrend. The World Social Report 2020, however, sends a clear message. The outcome of these megatrends is not set. While inequality is very high worldwide, the direction, the timing, and the intensity of change in inequality vary across countries. This is even within regions and among countries at similar levels of development and equally exposed to new technologies and to other megatrends. In other words, policies matter. But in addition to analyzing the four megatrends, the World Social Report also examines different dimensions of group-based inequalities linked to a person's ethnicity, place of birth, age, sex, disability status, religion, or socioeconomic or other status. These inequalities usually translate into an inequitable access to opportunities, which help to perpetuate the inequalities across generations. Group-based prejudice and discrimination remain a powerful force, even in today's societies. There is ample scope for governments and institutions to address distributional concerns and to seize the opportunities that these megatrends bring. By redoubling the efforts to reduce inequality now, action to address climate change or the unequal effects of new technologies can be made easier and faster. Clearly, there is no single set of policies applicable to all countries or in all contexts. Instead, the World Social Report highlights the basic building blocks of any comprehensive policy strategy to reduce inequality in all of its dimensions. First, promoting equal access to opportunity for all, regardless of status. Second, ensuring that macroeconomic policies contribute to reducing inequality. Third, strengthening social protection systems, which are often the foundation for addressing inequalities. And fourth, tackling prejudice and discrimination. As the United Nations celebrates its 75th anniversary, the World Social Report 2020 frames the global conversation on reducing inequalities as a key condition for building the future that we want. Thank you very much. I turn it over now to my colleague Marta with more detail on the report itself.
Thank you and good afternoon, everyone. So broadly, since 1990, inequality in income has increased in a majority of developed countries and in some middle-income countries, including China and India. At the same time, though, although income inequality is very high, it has declined in almost all Latin American countries. At least it did from 1990 to the early 2010s. It's increasing again in some Latin American countries, including Brazil and Mexico. And despite the overall decline in inequality in these Latin American countries, the share of income owned by the richest 1% has not declined in, for example, Brazil, which has relatively good data on this issue. So as Mr. Harris has said, the timing and direction of inequality trends differs by regions and even within regions by country. Not all European countries have seen inequality increase, for instance. Which brings me to the point that that Elliot also mentioned, policies matter. Trends differ across countries that have experienced similar rates of economic growth, that are similarly exposed to trade, that even have similar rates of technology adoption and diffusion, that are similarly exposed to climate change, right? The world is changing fast. These global trends could push inequality further up, but the scope for independent policy making, that is the impact of national policies, must not be understated. Now, beyond income, a consequential of inequalities is inequality of opportunity, as measured usually by inequalities between different groups of the population. Group-based inequalities explain as much as 70% of all inequalities in some countries. Yet information on group-based inequality is often ignored, sometimes because there are no data to measure it. Based on our findings, covering a significant number of developing countries, gaps in, for instance, child health measured by child stunting, between children in poor and rich households, between children from ethnic minorities and the ethnic majority, between children in rural and urban areas, are somewhat shrinking, but not fast enough. So under current trends, children left behind now in terms of stunting will still be left behind by 2030. Similar data indicate that other group-based inequalities, for instance, in secondary education, are actually growing. Progress for children who live in poor households or that belong to ethnic minorities is lower than for other groups. So all in all, gaps in opportunity are widespread and are not closing fast enough. Children's chances in life continue to depend on who their parents are, where they live, or what they own. And why does it matter that inequalities are growing? In the evidence that we present in the report, we show that countries that experience high inequalities are less effective at reducing poverty, in general grow more slowly, inequality affects us all. There's more political instability in countries that have high inequalities. There's less trust in institutions. And also, as importantly, high inequalities make it harder to mobilize support for those policies that can help reduce inequality. Why is that? One reason is that high inequalities alienate those people that could benefit the most from the policies put in place to reduce inequalities, okay, and reduce their trust in other people and in institutions. Mr. Harris has presented what we call the basic building blocks of any comprehensive strategy to address inequality, so I won't go through the specific policies or building blocks again. Just to mention, to highlight that in isolation, no policy will be enough to reduce inequality, right? What we present in our report is a package of economic and social policies that should work in tandem to reduce inequality. A general framework of sorts, right? I have to say that sometimes instead of working in tandem, economic and social policies have worked in different directions. In the sense that economic policies have not helped address social issues or reduce inequality per se. So to conclude, the report's main message is that there are choices. Growing inequality is not destiny. Policy has contributed to increasing inequality, but can help reduce it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Edie?
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, thank you for doing this press conference. 2 questions. First, what data are all of these findings based on? I assume it's UN data, but exactly what is it? And secondly, there's one very striking figure here, particularly in a growing technological world, that about 87% of people in developed countries have internet access compared to 19% in developing countries. And you seem to indicate that nothing's being done about this. Why and how important is rectifying this imbalance to really fighting inequality?
Thank you. Please. Yep.
I'm going to leave Marta perhaps to respond to the question of the data sources, but on the question of the internet access, that is symptomatic of what we would call the digital divide right now. And given the fact that our economies and our societies are increasingly digitalized and becoming more rapidly so, the fact that this technological digital divide exists virtually condemns those on the wrong side of the divide to fall further and further behind. Now, we don't mean to imply that nothing is being done. The problem is that it's not being done fast enough. And we have 2 problems. On the one hand, there is the lack of the digital infrastructure that's needed that allows people to use the internet, but there's also the lack of access to the internet in the sense of the devices that allow people to have that access. These are problems that can be solved to a certain extent through the engagement of the private sector. There are massive markets out there that, if only the right conditions are in place, would generate a very healthy return to any technological company that invests in them, but those right conditions have to be in place. And I think that is one of the challenges that we refer to when we talk about the policy environment that can alter the outcome of the impact of these megatrends. If we have the right policies in place that will encourage the investments in, let's say, the digital infrastructure that we need to provide internet access to all, then that investment will flow. If the right policy environment is not there, no amount of government investment is going to be enough. Similarly, it's not enough to just have the physical infrastructure in place. People have to have access to it. As we move forward from 4G into 5G, the bar gets higher and higher. And the devices that we used here in this country when we were all at 3G, which can perhaps be repurposed into other countries now that are still at 3G, they will not work for 5G. And so we have that additional challenge of making sure that people can use whatever infrastructure is put in place so that these technological hurdles can be overcome. Thank you.
So in terms of the data and indicators, traditionally and even now, most of the data to measure inequality come from surveys, nationally representative large surveys that are also used for official SDG follow-up, that are UN official data. There are surveys that are available in many countries, such as the demographic and health surveys or other surveys. They provide a significant amount of information to estimate inequality. Currently, survey data are complemented by other types of data, such as tax data, tax reports, national accounts data. So there are several sources of information that are put together to estimate inequality. Linked to that is the question of what indicators do we use to measure inequality. The data that I have presented today right here are on the Gini coefficient, which is a summary measure of inequality. It's one number that should give you a summary measure of the whole inequality. There are other ways to present findings on inequality based, for instance, on something I measure too, the share of income owned by the top 1%, the richest 1% of the population, or the share of income owned by the bottom 40 or 50% of the population. Those are complementary measures that are increasingly available, increasingly used, but that are not yet available for all countries in the world, especially developing countries, right? That's just for income. Then, obviously, inequality has many dimensions, income being only one. We also have to measure group-based inequalities, and there also we rely on surveys mostly. Data to measure inequality are still at an early stage. They are being improved by the day, but there's a lot that can be done still to improve the data and information.
Thank you. Joe?
Joseph Klein, Canada Free Press. I also have two questions. First, on the taxes that you say the tax rate in developed countries fell from 66% in 1981 to 43% in 2018. Have you taken account as well of the broadening of the base of taxable revenue that has occurred over that time? In other words, certainly in the United States, the elimination of quite a number of loopholes. I'm not saying that all the loopholes have been eliminated, but the base is, in terms of revenue has been broadened. So I'm wondering to what extent you take that into account. And secondly, on technology, you say that jobs are increasingly being phased out or lost as, quote, technologies are being captured by a small number of dominant companies. I'd like you to elaborate on what you consider to be the technologies that are dominated by a handful of companies. Maybe you're talking about, for example, internet search, social media. I'm wondering whether you would include a company like Amazon, which has brought down pricing, but also has affected labor and squeezed out small businesses. Could you just elaborate a bit on when you talk about the effect of a small number of companies dominating which technologies? Thank you. And what would you prescribe as a remedy for that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. First question on the taxes. Yes, indeed. It is based upon the total revenue generated to the overall economy, to the overall GDP. And that takes into account the widening of the tax base. But what we have sort of determined over time in OECD countries is a very marked decline in the taxation of corporate profits. And that is a deliberate response by policy. Policy has decided this is what should happen. Now, what that has meant is that in many cases the tax revenue generally available for combating, or let's say, for meeting the obligations of governments has been somewhat limited in terms of its growth relative to the growth of the underlying economy, for the one thing. And secondly, because of the reduction in taxes at the upper end of the income scale, the progressivity of taxes in some countries has actually declined. Now, bearing in mind that it is the progressive tax system that is part of the arsenal of government measures that can be used to combat income inequality, this is part of the reason why we see a rise in inequality in some of these advanced countries. Now, on to the technology question. I think it's much less a question of which types of technology. They're all technologies based on the digital economy. The point, however, is that some of the companies that have managed to establish a market-dominating position are in a position, if you will, to benefit from having access to or generating flows of data, including personal data, that are in fact becoming the new currency of the digital economy. And these data, they have access to them, and they determine in many respects how these data can be used. And they can use these data to their own advantage, but they can also prevent access to these data by competitors. And this is one of the problems that we've seen in this digital space, is that the market-dominant position of the big players tends to prevent the smaller players from gaining a foothold in the market. Now, the European Union in particular has expressed concern over this question of the data. Who owns the data? How is it being used? and they've issued a regulation to that effect. This is one of the concerns that we have, that the concentration of market power now has the impact of preventing a competitive or reducing the competition in that marketplace going forward, and the advantage that is created by these companies having access, principal and primary access to massive amounts of data which are not then freely available to all, creates a further advantage which perpetuates that inequitable positioning on the market. So this is the essence of the concern. Now, what policy should be? Well, again, I just cited the European regulation that is one step in that direction. But the key point is that governments have to decide, based not only on political considerations, but also on considerations of social justice, what exactly needs to happen to manage the flow of data that is being generated. Because these data are, in fact, as some have called it, some commentators, the new oil. And if that new oil is in the hands of just a few companies and not available to others, then that necessarily creates an inequitable position on the markets.
But I don't know if you discussed this in the full report, but you talked about the impact on competition. And again, there are certain large companies that have taken advantage of their platforms and to allegedly exclude smaller competitors or absorb them. So do you prescribe remedies such as splitting up some of these companies, requiring equal access through regulation, curbing mergers and acquisitions by, I mean, do you get to that level
No,
of
we
granularity?
don't. Those sorts of measures can be taken by individual governments. In some cases, they have been taken by individual governments in the past to deal with situations of preoccupying market power. But again, what might work in one context might not necessarily work in another. We are the United Nations. We can't be prescribing policies for individual and sovereign member states to be taking based on what we think might work. What we do point out are, here are some of the problems that this current technological situation is generating. And these are the problems that governments have to sit down and start to address, because if we fail to do that, these concentration of market power will have, inevitably, consequences that will be even more difficult to manage as time progresses. And so the encouragement, and it's not a prescription, it's an encouragement, is that governments, together with their partners, all stakeholders, should sit down now and start to think about how does one want to manage this going forward, understanding that the technological innovation is going to continue. It's not a good idea to think about stopping it because it brings benefits with it, but we have to see how we manage the downsides that are inevitably associated with this kind of rapid change. Thank you.
Marta, did you want to add something?
I just want something on the taxes. So what we present here are nominal tax rates, right? What the government imposes. Independently of whether the total tax revenue has increased and the tax rate has increased, the fact that the top tax rates have declined means that a lot of potential revenue has been lost, right? This is just what and the fact itself that the top tax rates have declined so much in the last 30 years should be a cause of concern. Why have there? There's potential to increase them and collect much more revenue than is collected now.
Thank you. Carla?
You mentioned that a lot depends upon the policies that the reduction in inequality to a large extent depends upon the policies that governments decide upon. And I remember not too long ago, Juan Somavia and Michelle Bachelet were calling for a social protection floor, which sounds very similar to what Franklin Roosevelt did in his New Deal and then in his Economic Bill of Rights, which never was made into law in this country. And as a follow-up, there's a Security Council which deals with global peace and stability, but as this inequality increases, it leads to conflict and great instability. And there had been talk long ago of an Economic Security Council here, which I understand that the United States opposed. But what are the odds of getting something like that, which would help to coordinate policies globally? Because the problems are global now.
You're asking for odds. I would suggest that I'm not likely to be able to give you an answer on that. We also don't have. We've seen the the difficulties that we've had in the UN, and some of these types of reforms that have been put on the table and haven't really advanced as easily as possible. But it is indeed a fact, and you hit the nail on the head, that this rising inequality brings with it the potential for rising social instability and possibly also conflict. And so I would suggest that it's in the interests of all member states to confront this rising inequality and the phenomenon that drives it up front, and to cooperate as much as possible in addressing some of the driving factors. Now, you made reference to the social protection floor that Michelle Bachelet, she headed the commission that worked on this. And the principle behind that is that the social protection floor provides a sort of an insurance to prevent people from falling through the cracks to the point where destitution and desperation could lead them into situations of conflict with their neighbors, or undermine the social cohesion of any society. And in fact, that also has a pronounced economic benefit as well, because the social protection floor helps to ensure not only a certain minimum of income, but a certain minimum of consumption. And in cases where economies go into downturn, this can make the difference for maintaining a certain level of aggregate demand and preventing the recession from getting deeper. In fact, it has been shown that when the global financial crisis hit in 2008, the countries that suffered the least pronounced downturn and the ones that had the quickest recovery from the downturn were the ones with elaborate social protection systems in place for exactly that reason. So there are a lot of very relevant reasons to consider a social protection floor, but we also see that as a part of the instruments that governments have in place, that societies, better put, have in place for dealing with this question of inequality. It's a certain minimum below which the floor doesn't allow citizens to fall. And of course, we would think that the floor is just the starting point, and a universal social protection system that could be much more elaborate should be put in place because of all the advantages that it brings. Thank you.
Arun Lewis from Indo-Asian News Service. I'm raising a question regarding a conundrum. For example, you point out that India and China, the rates of inequality have increased. But on the other hand, while there was less inequality, there was also greater levels of poverty. And it seems that while inequality increased, the levels of poverty also came down. So how do you deal with this conundrum?
You can take it and I can continue.
One of the, I don't know how to put this, one of the most interesting phenomena of the last 30 years has been the way in which China and India in particular have been able to bring down the levels of absolute poverty through deliberate government policy and by opening up the economies for a greater degree of participation in global trade. Now, what that has also meant is that part of the way in which these economies have been able to benefit from that is by the reduction of some of the legislations that held them back in the past, some of the regulations and strictures that prevented economic activity from unfolding. As a necessary corollary of that, there have been some firms and some individuals who've been better able to benefit from these new opportunities that have existed. And at the same time, the ability to spread the growing income equitably across such massive populations is somewhat limited. There's only so much that government redistribution policies can do. And that is what explains, on the one hand, the fact that you've had overall incomes rising, so the levels of poverty have declined, but the distribution of that income within the country has skewed towards the upper end. There are some who benefit more from the very factors that raise overall income, and that unless there's corrective policy in place, that necessarily leads to an increase in income inequality. So I wouldn't call it a perfectly natural phenomenon, but it's easily explainable by the fact that there wasn't in place a deliberate policy to prevent this accumulation of income and wealth at the top end of the scale, the ones most well-placed to benefit from the liberalization and the expansion of the overall economic activity. Marta, do you want to add on that?
I mean, this is a historical period in which economic growth, especially in China, has been very strong, right? Was very strong. There are transition periods like that in many countries where economic growth is very high, and so a country is able to reduce poverty, as Elliot has said, and at the same time, even if inequality keeps growing, because some people get ahead faster than others. Now, eventually, as a country develops, even if economic growth declines, one should expect inequality also to decline. The problem is that when inequality becomes encroached and doesn't decline, as we are observing now in many developed countries, will inequality decline in China and India as maybe their economic growth goes down and they develop? That's the big question.
Yes, one last question. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Samira with Interpress Service. In your executive summary, you mentioned that disparities in health and education make it challenging to come out of the poverty for a lot of communities. And I'm curious to know, in a world with an unprecedented number of refugees and a continuing refugee crisis, how do you close that gap? Because it feels like it's a vicious cycle where communities are constantly being displaced and thus not having access to health and education.
Indeed, and I think that is a very serious concern that we have. Part of the, as you know, we passed in December 2018 two global compacts, one on migration, one on refugees. And the Global Compact on Refugees tried to address that issue by encouraging the countries that are hosting the refugees to extend to them, to the extent possible, and with the support of the international community, the types of services that we think are part of the overall human rights of every individual. That includes the right of health care, the right of education. The problem, of course, is that in many cases the refugees are concentrated in places that do not have large amounts of additional resources they can devote to supporting the refugees. And so they are very dependent upon the support of the international community. It's been relatively, I won't say easy, it's been less difficult, if you will, to mobilize support at the onset of the crisis when people have to flee. But maintaining that support when, in some cases, they're in refugee camps or displaced from their homelands for years at a time, that becomes much more difficult. And we see the situation in Lebanon in particular, but also in Jordan right now, where for many years they've been hosting a very large influx of refugees, in particular from the Syrian crisis, and that has provided or been the source of a tremendous strain on the capacity of their economies and societies to absorb and provide all the services to these refugees. And it is really a responsibility for the international community to step up and assist these host countries in dealing with this humanitarian crisis, because that's what it boils down to being. On the other hand, we can't neglect efforts as well to resolve the issues that cause the displacement in the first place and to make it possible for these refugees to return home. Unfortunately, in many cases, that has proven to be particularly difficult given the geopolitical situations that we face. So we're in a very tight situation, very constrained situation here, and it is quite clear that the refugees, especially those who have been displaced for many years, belong to that group to those groups of individuals who are falling behind in terms of equality.
One last quick question from Evelyn, and then we'll go.
Quick question. Did you notice any trend among the refugees? Which group among the ones who suffer from inequalities, excluding natural disasters, seem to want to leave the most? Or is there no trend? Is it a bit of everyone?
Unfortunately, there are very few data that allow us to follow refugees through time and see which ones are doing better or not better, right? I think the more they are integrated into the societies where they live, the more they have rights, the better they do, of course. But I don't know of any data set that would allow us to track how well they do or not.
And I think it also depends as well the duration of their displacement. I mean, in some cases it's relatively short term, but in other cases it's very protracted. And people are living in refugee status for 10, 20 years. And their children, for example, are at a severe disadvantage. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.